Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
I am Caleb.
I'm Nate, and once again, you can give to our podcast, allow us to be able to do more through Mercy Hill's website, mercyhillshep.org. Go to giving and then designate the gift to the Bible in Context.
Yep, and also just another reminder, we are going to be dropping down to releasing one episode every other week rather than every week for now. And we may dial that back up at some point, but just be aware if you're missing an episode, we just haven't released one yet, so just wait another week. So where are we at this week?
All right, so we are still in chapter 3, and so last time we talked about the first half of chapter 3, which was really a big run-on sentence, a parenthetical, a parentheses, where Paul starts this thought at the very beginning of the chapter where he says, and for this reason, but he never tells you what he's going to do. And he goes on this, right. I don't know if you want to call it a rabbit trail, but this parenthetical statement where he's making this argument.
A planned rabbit trail.
Yeah, a planned rabbit trail. That's a good way to look at it. And on this planned rabbit trail, what he's trying to do is help his original audience understand that, yeah, I'm in prison, but my message, it comes from God, and you need to listen to it. And so just because I've got a low status in the world's eyes doesn't mean I have a low status in God's kingdom. In fact, he's given me this gift of being an ambassador to you Gentiles. And he's revealed to me this mystery that was hidden for the ages, and he puts himself in the kind of the same status as a prophet of old here. And so
he actually says that explicitly, which I don't think I hit on it super hard last time, but in verse 5 in this chapter 3, he says, talking about the mystery of Christ, saying, which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, and it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. And what's interesting here is, I think it's easy to glaze over that statement, and especially even though in context it has a different meaning, when we read the word prophets, we're immediately thinking Old Testament, right? But he says, it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets. And so I think he's putting himself to be one of these apostles and prophets. This is probably a little bit of a overlapping role, because the apostles, it's the sent out ones, they are sent out to carry on the prophetic role to Jew and Gentile alike around the world. And so it's just interesting to see here that when Jesus sends these people out, and when they are commissioned by Jesus, by the Spirit, to go and proclaim, they're counted as prophets here, because they are fulfilling the function of a prophet, a proclaimer. So yeah, he has established his authority, and then he picks up his thought again in verse 14 with, for this reason I bow my knees before the Father. Now, before we keep going, something that you didn't mention yet in your summary is, for what reason? Yeah,
so the reason that he's been explaining in chapter 1 and 2, right? That this mystery has been revealed. This Gentiles have been now grafted into true Israel. The nations have been invited into the community of believers and part of the kingdom of God. They're members, they're partakers of the promises and all the benefits and the blessings that go with that. That's what he's been celebrating from the very beginning in that song. And he's in his first prayer, it's a prayer of thanksgiving for that.
Yeah, and this prayer is actually very similar in function to the first. There is thanksgiving in it as well, but in the first, he explained the significance of the gospel. He explained that the Gentiles are being grafted into the remnant of Israel. And I've actually started to use that phrase now in the past couple episodes, the remnant of Israel. I think that's probably, hopefully, less confusing and more precise, even than true Israel. I've been saying true Israel the whole time, but now that I think about it, remnant might be helpful.
Yeah,
I probably will slip up, but I'm going to try to do that. So the Gentiles have been grafted into Israel. And then he gives this prayer in chapter 1 of thanksgiving for that, and he prays that they would understand the gravity of what he's telling them, the gravity of the gospel. And so then he spends chapter 2 explaining a little bit more about how the Gentiles are folded in from another perspective. In chapter 3, he continues off of that thought, reminds them of his authority to tell them this very strange and revolutionary message that he's explained in chapters 1 and 2. And then again, he prays for them to understand the gravity of this message of the gospel. That is what he is doing here in these final verses of chapter 3, once again. And you see the repetition and just the structuring of this letter in that repetition. So, for this reason, he's saying, since the Gentiles have been grafted into the remnant of Israel, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have the strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with the fullness of God. So a few interesting things going on in this passage. One thing I think that, again, and I'm hitting on some of this more esoteric kind of feeling phrases and passages. Maybe it's just because of some of those I'm having conversations with. But what do you think that the inner being is referring to?
So you're talking about verse 16? Or no, 17.
Verse 16.
No, actually, yeah, 16. That according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being. I mean, it sounds like an inner, I guess what comes to my mind is like an inner peace or an inner joy, an internal personal empowerment of the Spirit to, I guess, a spiritual vitality, strength.
Yeah, and so I think what Paul is referring to here is in your inner being. He's talking about your kind of the American conception of heart, of your seat of emotions, the seat of your reasoning and thought. And this isn't just emotion, but the heart, especially in this culture, was the place where you did all of your reasoning, not just your emotions, but your thoughts as well, all together. And so he's praying that their hearts and minds would be strengthened by the Spirit, and with power as well. And I think this is an interesting place, again, to see the word power show up, because we can think of this power as, again, something taking over and supernatural. And with this, I think Paul has something very practical in mind. When we see power, we think of power, we're thinking immediately of supernatural and of miraculous. And I don't want to say that's not going on behind this passage, but I don't want to say that this is only things that seem and feel supernatural, to where if it's not giving you butterflies, it's not the Spirit strengthening you. I think there's also a very mundane way this plays out in us understanding and being either in awe of what Christ has done, or having that truth in our mind that gives us perseverance to live in the way that, or live according to the values of his kingdom. I think that is also a way this plays out. And so sometimes we can see, again, power and just think it has to be supernatural, incomprehensible, but it may also just be that, God is working through his people by his Spirit and giving us what seems to be a mundane ability to understand and to praise and to persevere because of the truths of his kingdom and what Jesus has done. And I don't say all that to, again, negate supernatural things the Spirit is doing. And I think that does happen. I also don't want to leave the possibility open that if you're not getting the supernatural butterflies that the person next to you is getting or thinks they're getting, that the Spirit's not at work in you. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the way Paul envisions this. But have you seen that, in your pastoral ministry, the difference between those who maybe are more charismatic and those who are not, and maybe those who feel that they have, this is all a very beyond natural thing, and those who, their Christian life, while there is some, the Spirit is at work in them, but it's not like they are having, miracles all around them kind of thing, and feeling a tension because they don't see those miracles going on.
Yeah, I think that there is definitely, especially in our culture, we've got a lot of different expressions of how the Spirit works. And I think there are some who maybe get discouraged that they don't experience some kind of miraculous event, that they can tell that the Spirit's working. Sometimes I think it's a spectrum. There's a spectrum there where you've got some who I think are looking for goosebumps under everything or in everything. And then on the flip side of that, though, I think there are some that it's not hard, especially in our culture, to kind of be numb to the Spirit working and just like he's working, but you're just not even aware of it. And so I think There's something we can learn from each other that maybe the hyper charismatic person can can kind of learn from those who have a solid relationship with the Lord, but don't necessarily look for goosebumps all the time. There's something healthy about that, I think. But on the flip side, those who are very much and the cessationists to the extreme, I think could learn something from the charismatic and become more aware of the Spirit's working and moving in them.
Yeah, that's well said. It's good. And so with that understanding, as we go on, what does it mean that in verse 17, so Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you being rooted and grounded in love? So I think this idea of Christ being dwelling, of Christ dwelling in our hearts through faith, that is because of our trust in Him, He, the Spirit, is dwelling in us, going back to that same idea that he just mentioned, that is strengthening us in our inner being, in our hearts and our minds, all being wrapped up, as well as with the idea of us being God's temple from the previous passage. And with that, it's just interesting to note here that all of these yous are plural. So this is, may you all be strengthened through power. May you in y'all's inner being. And so just a lot of communal language all throughout this.
Yeah, it's good to be reminded of that. We lose sight of that in our hyper-individualistic society. Yeah.
So what does it mean that they are rooted and grounded in love? It seems like this could be unclear, and there are a couple different ways that you could take this. And this could mean that, so Christ dwells in them through their trust and loyalty to Him, which is manifested in their love for others being poured out. And so it could be that they have become people who reflect God's love, or it could mean that they are people who are in God's love, being loved by God. And I do think that in this context, Paul is kind of encouraging them through this little statement on the side. And so I think either one could make sense, but this may make more sense as saying that they are rooted and grounded in a disposition of love because they are reflecting what God has shown them. So this is about their love rather than about God's love for them. Though either could fit into this passage. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. And sometimes I think maybe things like this could be a both and also.
Could be a both and. So verse 18 is where it actually gets it trips a lot of people up, where he says, he kind of breaks off his thought in the middle of verse 18. And so it can make it a little bit confusing, as he says, or he asks that the people may have strength to comprehend with the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ. And so he just kind of stops, like, the breadth, length, height, and depth of what? What is he talking about?
Right, that's a great question. Is he talking about what he just been talking about, or is he talking about something he just assumes us to know what it is?
Yeah, I think he's kind of building and just flourishing this point, and he's pointing all of this, or he's using all of this to say, I want you to know the love of Christ. So whenever he says to know with all, or to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth, length, width, and depth of the love of Christ, and then in verse 19 he says to know, hang on, I'm not saying that very well. So he starts off this sentence by asking that they have the strength to comprehend the breadth, length, height, and depth, and to know the love of Christ. And those words comprehend and to know are very similar. I think what he's doing here is he wants them to comprehend the breadth, length, depth of the love of Christ, to understand how great it is. And so he's just flourishing here and using, again, heightened language, being poetic. And so he kind of breaks off his thought before he says the love of Christ and says, I want you to comprehend, to know the love of Christ. So he's kind of reiterating that thought in that sentence. It makes it a little confusing the way he words it. But again, he's just building and building and building as he says, I want you to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge. And again, I think this goes into a prayer for understanding the love, the loyalty, the favor which Christ has shown you, so that you may be filled with the fullness of God.
Yeah, what's that mean?
So all this is about them knowing the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, so that they may be filled with the fullness of God. And that's another one that, again, we can take in different ways. In what way does God fill us?
So is there a hyperlink back to Ephesians 1:23 here? So that's the end of the prayer, the first prayer, right? Where he says, which is his body, talking about the church, the fullness of him who fills all in all. Are we supposed to interpret what's going on in that second prayer in light of that?
I think there are some related concepts in those, but I think this one is a little bit different because this is not about the church being the fullness of Christ, being his authority on the earth, or being representations of his authority on the earth. Rather, this is linked more so to an idea in chapter 4, verse 13. And so let me go there real quick. So before I read verse 4:13, I do want to mention a translation thing here with I do want to mention a translation issue. I think I would translate verse 19 a little bit differently here in chapter 3, where it says that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. I think that should better be translated as that you may be filled or completed for the fullness of God, or filled or completed to the fullness of God. So it's not being filled with, but rather filled to or for the fullness of God. Let me explain what I mean there. So the reason I say that is because the word there for with is actually the word Greek word eis, which is kind of moving towards to or for something. And so I think we'd be better to translate this as to be filled to the fullness of God, or to be filled for the fullness of God. So this seems to be a statement of our purpose. And so I think if we read verse 4:13, we'll get a little bit of clarity on what this means. Do you want to read that one?
So 4:13 says, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and to the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ.
Okay, so in this verse, the fullness of Christ is equated with a mature stature in the faith. And so I think this has to do with, rather this being about us being mature in unity, which is, again, there in verse 3, it says that we may attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of God, or to the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood. So mature manhood, a measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, is a maturity where we can live in the unity that is fitting for the people of God. So to be filled with the fullness of God, I think, has to do with our maturity as we understand the implications of the gospel. We live that out. And in particular, Paul equates that in verse 13 with the unity that is to be between the saints. And again, you just see unity throughout this book over and over and over again. It's all about reconciling those that are outside to inside the group. It's all about the believers being unified, loving one another, and not having all these dividing walls and disputes that are going on. Something that Paul hits on a lot and that we need to, I think, focus on, because we live in a culture where I don't mean this to imply that the Reformation was a bad thing, but we are built on a foundation of dividing from what we think is wrong. And there is some good about that, but then when we get skewed and start to say that things that are secondary or primary, we start to break off for things that are not actually wrong, even though we think they are. You get to the point where, well, this secondary issue of infant baptism is enough for me to break fellowship with you. Or I don't like the color of the carpet that you picked out for our sanctuary, so I'm breaking off. Or just anything and everything becomes permissible because we're so used to it. And we need to realize that we need to start to build those bridges back and be unified as the church, not breed more division. And so we need to take the time to really learn and focus on what is secondary and what is primary. And how do we preach the gospel in such a way that we can still be distinctive with what we may believe compared to our neighbor if we think we're right, but still honor that tradition and still honor the fact that we are all brothers and sisters. And speaking from, again, someone who used to be very, very convinced by Calvinist doctrine, trying to learn, how do I not preach, even if you are a Calvinist, how do I not just preach a exclusively Calvinist gospel? How do I not preach just an exclusively Arminian gospel, or in any kind of doctrinal stream you may be in? What is just the core that everyone can agree upon? Start there, and then you can start to walk someone who you're discipling in. Here's what I in particular believe about these topics. Others may disagree, but we're still holding true to the core.
Yeah, I think that's an important implication of the book of Ephesians too, as it talks so much about unity.
Absolutely. So, all that to say, Ephesians 3:19, to be filled for the fullness of God is to be filled, or to be filled to the fullness of God is to be filled with the knowledge of Christ, such that we are mature and our lives and our virtues reflect the virtues of God's kingdom, and we are ultimately unified, not dividing.
That makes sense.
So So having said all this, Paul wraps this up in verse 20 and 21 by just giving a second short doxology here, saying, "Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us," which is a reference back to verse 16, the power that is causing us to understand the love of Christ and to be in all of it and to live in light of it. "To him be the glory of the church and of Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen."
Such
he
a
puts
beautiful,
a nice, neat bow.
Yeah, it's just a beautiful way to kind of end this this episode on. But I mean, also just the end of the first half of the letter to just remind us that God is able to do way more than we can even think, and instilling in us this powerful work to be filled and to be matured and to know His love in such amazing ways.
Yeah. And even if it is very clearly supernatural or seemingly mundane, either way, Paul is confident that His power is at work within us, and that those of us who are seeing the love of Christ, who understand it, and it is affecting the way we live out our lives, affecting the virtues that we show, that God is doing more abundantly than even He has asked to help us understand the love of Christ and to reflect it and live in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we all go through seasons where we feel the presence of the Lord and the power of the Spirit working in us, and we should celebrate those moments. But then there's also seasons we go through where we just are not aware, that we don't feel the same level of God's presence or Him working within us. And in those moments, I think it's good to be reminded of what we see here in Ephesians, that God is still doing His work in the midst of us. And sometimes those seasons that feel dry, God's using those to refine our faith and purify our souls and preparing us for really a spiritual renewal. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's a good reminder, especially since I think many, depending on the streams they're in, can be crushed by the fact that they don't feel the way they think that they should feel about their faith. And but if they place their trust and their loyalty and their love in Christ, then they are part of the family, part of that Gentile community that has been grafted into the remnant of Israel.
Good word.
And then the next time we'll jump into chapter 4 to kind of talk about some of the implications as Paul starts to flesh out what does this look like in a unified community now that the Gentiles have been brought under a Jewish Messiah into the remnant of Israel, under the King of all the universe.
Sounds like a plan.